Scandal, power, and influence. These are words we often use to describe modern celebrities, politicians, and cultural icons. We live in a world where a single headline can make or break a reputation, where gossip often drowns out achievement, and where public figures are defined less by what they do than by what people say about them. But what if I told you that this is not a modern problem at all? What if the same forces shaping reputations today also haunted figures 2 centuries ago? Imagine someone who was whispered about at every dinner table, written about in gossip columns, and judged endlessly for her private choices, yet who quietly shaped politics, literature, and intellectual life in ways that history books barely acknowledge. That person was Lady Holland. In the early 19th century, she was one of the most talked about women in Britain, not because of her accomplishments, but because of the scandal that surrounded her. She left her first husband in a move that shocked polite society and remarried, creating a storm of disapproval that never fully faded. For many, she became a symbol of impropriety, an outsider who dared to ignore the rules of her class. Yet behind that public image was a woman of extraordinary resilience, intellect, and ambition. She built Holland House into one of the greatest centers of political and literary discussion in her age, drawing in figures like Byron, Sidney Smith, and leading Whig politicians who found in her salon a space to refine their ideas. She supported writers, encouraged debate, and sustained liberal politics through years when they might otherwise have faltered. And yet, when people today remember Lady Holland, if they remember her at all, it is often the scandal that comes first. She is reduced to the caricature of a domineering hostess, sharp-tongued and controversial. But what happens when we look deeper? What happens when we strip away the gossip and ask what her life really tells us? We discover not just a woman at the center of scandal, but a woman who was ahead of her time, someone who refused to be silenced, who challenged the narrow expectations of her society, and who left a legacy far greater than the judgments of her critics. Her story speaks directly to us today because it shows how reputation can overshadow reality, how women in particular are judged by double standards, and how influence often works in hidden ways. Lady Holland's life is a reminder that history is not just about kings, parliaments, or official records. It is also about the voices that shaped the conversations, the hosts who built the spaces, and the individuals who defied convention to claim agency in a world that denied it to them. So, if you think history is only about dry facts or distant battles, think again. This is the story of scandal and survival, of gossip and greatness, of a woman who shaped her age while being judged by it. And perhaps, as we unravel her story, you might find yourself rethinking not just Lady Holland, but the way history itself is told. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video we are diving into the life and legacy of Lady Holland, a woman whose story of scandal and influence reveals far more than the gossip that defined her reputation. Stay with us as we uncover how she navigated public scrutiny, built one of the most important salons of the 19th century, and left behind a legacy that still resonates today. In the age of social media, it takes little more than a rumor or a photograph to spark debate. A comment can be taken out of context, an image shared without explanation, and within hours the name of a celebrity is dragged through countless arguments. People judge without hesitation, dividing into sides with little care for evidence or nuance. Such instant conclusions, fueled by gossip and emotion, feel like a modern problem. Yet when we look back at the lives of certain figures in history, we realize that swift judgment and scandal are not inventions of the digital era. Society has always been ready to turn an individual into a subject of whispers, speculation, or admiration, depending on the story that circulates. In the early years of the 19th century, one woman in particular became a lightning rod for both fascination and condemnation. That woman was Lady Holland. Lady Holland was born Elizabeth Vassall, the only child of Richard Vassall, a man of wealth whose family fortunes came from Jamaican estates. She entered life with advantages that promised influence and luxury, but her path was far from straightforward. When she married Sir Godfrey Webster, a wealthy and connected man, she gained the title that would forever cling to her name. Yet the marriage was unhappy. It quickly became clear to those around her that her wit, intelligence, and strong will did not match well with her husband's character. Within a short time, her personal life became the subject of gossip across drawing rooms, country houses, and newspapers. The story that turned Elizabeth, Lady Holland, into a figure of lasting notoriety was her affair with Henry Richard Fox, the third Lord Holland. Their relationship began openly, and within a society that prized discretion, such openness was shocking. In time she divorced Sir Godfrey Webster, a rare and scandalous step in itself, and married Lord Holland. Divorce in England during the early 19th century was nearly impossible for most, requiring an act of parliament and bringing social disgrace. For a woman, divorce carried even harsher consequences. To many, Lady Holland was bold to the point of recklessness, defying norms that had kept other women trapped in loveless unions. To others, she was immoral, selfish, and shameless. She was judged swiftly, and the verdict for much of polite society was harsh. Yet Lady Holland was not simply a woman who courted scandal. Once married to Lord Holland, she became the mistress of Holland House in Kensington, which turned into one of the most important social and political centers of the age. There, she hosted gatherings that drew leading politicians, writers, and thinkers. Statesmen debated policy under her roof, poets read their work, and foreign dignitaries exchanged ideas. The circle that formed around Holland House became a force that shaped opinion and provided a space for liberal thought in a time when political life was undergoing change. Lady Holland presided over these gatherings with energy and authority, her sharp mind leaving strong impressions on those who attended. Her reputation, however, was always double-edged. Admirers praised her intelligence, her wit, and her confidence in speaking her mind. Detractors saw arrogance, imperious manners, and self-indulgence. She was known for her sharp tongue, which did not spare even her closest friends. She could be generous, supporting writers and artists, yet also cutting, dismissing those who displeased her. Such contradictions fueled endless talk. Much like celebrities today who live under constant scrutiny, Lady Holland could never escape the shadow of gossip. Every choice she made, whether in her private life or in her role as hostess, was examined, judged, and recorded by others. In an era when women were expected to remain within limited roles, her visibility was both remarkable and threatening. Most women of her rank were supposed to maintain dignity through restraint, modesty, and silence in public affairs. Lady Holland refused such limits. She participated in conversations about politics, literature, and foreign affairs with confidence equal to any man present. Some were unsettled by this, describing her as domineering. Others found her presence stimulating, a reminder that women could be intellectual and socially influential in ways beyond conventional expectations. Holland House under her guidance became a place where important figures of the day were not only entertained but also influenced. The Whig Party, which stood for reform and was often in opposition to the ruling Tory government, found in Holland House a sympathetic base. Lady Holland herself was deeply partisan, fiercely loyal to Whig principles and unafraid to voice her opinions. She supported the abolition of slavery and causes that aligned with reform, though her own family wealth had been built upon plantations that depended on enslaved labor, a contradiction not lost on critics. Her involvement in political life was unusual, and her influence as a woman in those circles was significant. Beyond politics, Lady Holland played a key role in shaping cultural life. Writers such as Lord Byron, Charles James Fox, and Sydney Smith moved in her circles. The atmosphere at Holland House was one of exchange, debate, and creativity. Accounts from visitors describe evenings filled with intense conversation, where ideas flowed freely, and Lady Holland herself often directed the discussion. She insisted on intellectual rigor and was quick to challenge arguments she found weak. For some, this made her an inspiring hostess. For others, it felt overbearing. Still, the fact remains that her gatherings left a lasting imprint on the intellectual climate of her time. She also left behind a personal record that provides insight into her character and the era in which she lived. Her journals, preserved and later published, reveal her sharp observations and strong opinions. They also show her awareness of the judgments cast upon her. She often recorded impressions of those she encountered, sometimes flattering, often critical, always candid. These writings serve as a window into both her personality and the world of early 19th century Britain. The controversy around Lady Holland did not fade as she aged. Even after decades as the mistress of Holland House, she remained a figure who divided opinion. Those who admired her saw in her a woman who refused to conform, who shaped her environment through force of will and intellect. Those who disliked her saw only arrogance and impropriety. This tension makes her life particularly fascinating to study today. She was, in many ways, ahead of her time, challenging boundaries that confined women. At the same time, she was deeply enmeshed in the privileges and contradictions of her class. What makes Lady Holland's story resonate with modern parallels is the way she was defined by scandal, yet continued to build a life of influence. In contemporary culture, celebrities who fall from grace often either vanish from the public eye or carefully rebuild their reputations. Lady Holland had no public relations strategy, no team of advisors, no digital platform to defend herself. Her life played out in newspapers, in the letters of society figures, and in the judgments passed across dinner tables. Despite the negative talk, she persisted, carving out a space where her voice mattered. Her life also reminds us how little society changes when it comes to controlling narratives about women. Men of her era, including politicians and aristocrats, carried on affairs with little damage to their public standing. A woman who did the same, particularly one as visible as Lady Holland, was branded for life. Even as she hosted the most powerful men of her time, she was constantly criticized in ways her male counterparts never were. This double standard, still familiar today, was sharp and relentless in her own century. Holland House itself became a symbol of her legacy. It was more than a residence. It was a stage upon which political and cultural debates of early 19th century Britain unfolded. Visitors remembered not only the grandeur of the setting, but also the dynamism that Lady Holland brought to it. Long after her death, historians and biographers continued to describe Holland House as a center of Whig society, with Lady Holland at its heart. The network she nurtured there influenced thought and policy for decades. Her personality continues to draw debate. Was she a pioneering woman asserting herself in a restrictive society, or was she a domineering figure who enjoyed scandal? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Like many people of forceful character, she inspired both admiration and resentment. What cannot be denied is that she mattered, and she left an imprint far beyond the gossip that first attached itself to her name. In reflecting on Lady Holland's life, we can see how scandal and influence often go hand in hand. Public judgment may be swift, but history has a way of preserving complexity. While some of her contemporaries dismissed her as merely notorious, we can now see her as a woman who challenged conventions, hosted a circle that shaped politics and literature, and lived with an independence unusual for her time. Her story is a reminder that lives defined by scandal in one moment can, over time, reveal layers of meaning and significance. Today, when a celebrity is judged harshly for personal choices, when gossip spreads faster than truth, it is worth remembering Lady Holland. She shows us that scandal does not erase substance, that even those criticized for their personal lives can hold real power, and that judgment, once passed, is not the final word. Her life stands as proof that notoriety and influence often coexist, and that society's rush to condemn is as old as history itself. In thinking of Lady Holland, it is easy to imagine only the scandal that surrounded her in the earliest years of her marriage and the beginning of her relationship with Lord Holland. That scandal was so widely known at the time that it seemed to define her completely. Newspapers whispered about it, pamphlets hinted at it, and private letters described it in tones of shock or disapproval. In fashionable society, her name became shorthand for a bold woman who had disregarded the rules of propriety. Much as celebrities today are known first for one controversy that overshadows all else, Lady Holland's divorce and remarriage seemed to brand her permanently in the eyes of her contemporaries. It is a reminder of how strong and lasting public perception can be when it is formed at a moment of shock. But this leads us to an important question. What do we miss when we allow scandal and gossip to be the only lens through which we view a life? What is left out of history when judgment at first glance hardens into the full story? Lady Holland's reputation was shaped by the norms of her time, and those norms were rigid when it came to women. A woman of rank was expected to provide heirs, support her husband quietly, and maintain dignity without attracting gossip. Men could be unfaithful or reckless and still retain status, but a woman who broke with convention risked being cast out. Lady Holland's divorce from Sir Godfrey Webster was in itself a public spectacle, not because she was the first to take such a step, but because she was among the few women of high social standing who dared to do so openly. It required an act of parliament, and each step of that process exposed her private life to scrutiny. Once she married Lord Holland, her critics saw only confirmation of what they believed, that she was brazen and unrepentant. The gossip clung to her even as her role expanded into something far greater. If we look only at this scandal, however, we overlook the other dimensions of her life. Holland House became a gathering place where political currents met, where liberal ideas gained strength, and where writers and thinkers exchanged views that shaped public debate. Lady Holland was not a passive hostess. She was a force who animated conversation, directed its flow, and often challenged the men who sat around her table. This was no small matter in an age when women were expected to remain silent in such company. Her voice, her presence, and her opinions mattered. Those who reduced her to her personal choices failed to see the influence she exercised in one of the most important intellectual salons of her era. The danger of focusing only on scandal is that it erases complexity. It simplifies a person into a single act or choice and leaves no room for the rest of the story. In Lady Holland's case, what is missed is her role as a political hostess, her contribution to the life of the Whig Party, and her encouragement of writers and artists. What is missed is her resilience in the face of constant judgment, her ability to carve out authority in a sphere that had little space for women's voices, and her contradictions as someone who both supported reform and yet lived off the wealth tied to slavery. She was not easy to categorize, which is why the shorthand of scandal became so convenient for those unwilling to look deeper. The common knowledge of her time presented her as haughty, domineering, and scandalous. Friends and enemies alike noted her sharp tongue, her sometimes abrupt manner, and her unwillingness to flatter. This too became part of the caricature. Yet if we stop only at that surface, we miss the evidence of genuine intellectual engagement, of a woman who read widely, who corresponded with leading figures, and who thought seriously about the political and social questions of her day. The perception of arrogance may also be read as confidence, the refusal to diminish her intellect simply to please others. The very qualities that irritated some were the same ones that allowed her to preside over gatherings that mattered. This invites us to think more broadly about how history remembers figures like Lady Holland. Public scandal leaves a mark, but the deeper truths of a life require patience to uncover. When we ask what we miss by focusing only on the initial perceptions, the answer is that we lose the richness of context, the contradictions that make individuals human, and the evidence of influence that extends beyond personal gossip. For Lady Holland, what has endured is not simply the memory of a divorce, but the memory of Holland House as a center of thought, the journals that reveal her perspective, and the testimonies of those who recognized her significance even if they disliked her. She was a woman judged quickly, but she lived a long life in which she built connections, shaped debates, and left a mark on the political and cultural life of early 19th century Britain. Her story shows us that judgment at first glance can never capture the full truth of a person. When we slow down, look past the scandal, and examine the layers of her life, we find a figure far more complex, influential, and enduring than gossip alone would suggest. And so, returning to the modern parallel with which we began, we might think about how we judge today's figures, how quickly we let one headline define them, and how much we fail to see when we do so. Lady Holland reminds us that scandal may draw attention, but it is never the whole story. Her life urges us to look beyond the noise, to consider what else lies beneath the judgments, and to understand that history, like human character, is always richer than the first impression. When we think about Lady Holland, the tension between how she was seen and who she truly was lies at the center of her story. In her own lifetime, she was both celebrated and condemned, admired and ridiculed, and this split between her public persona and private reality has shaped how she has been remembered. Society at the time was quick to assign labels, and once those labels were attached, they proved hard to shake. Gossip was powerful, judgment was swift, and reputation carried immense weight. Lady Holland's life demonstrates how a woman could become a public figure through scandal while also living privately as someone of depth, intellect, and ambition, whose true influence was often obscured by the chatter that surrounded her name. In polite society of the early 19th century, gossip traveled faster than official news. Letters carried whispers from one drawing room to another, caricatures in print mocked recognizable figures, and conversation at dinners spread and sharpened rumors. Lady Holland was a prime target for such attention. Her divorce from Sir Godfrey Webster and subsequent marriage to Lord Holland became one of the most talked-about events of its time. For many, the story was simple. A young woman of wealth and beauty had thrown off her husband and rushed into the arms of another man, showing no regard for decency. Such was the narrative that circulated, and once it took hold, it overshadowed everything else she did. Contemporary accounts underline just how scandalous her reputation became. Some described her as bold to the point of indecency, unwilling to hide her affection for Lord Holland even before her divorce. Others criticized the very public way in which the proceedings unfolded. Divorce required an act of Parliament, and the debates themselves drew attention that turned private affairs into a spectacle. Her name was spoken with disapproval by many who had never met her. This was her public persona, the woman who had shocked England, the woman whose ambition had broken with social convention, the woman who carried herself with a confidence that many called arrogance. But beneath this surface there was another side. The private Lady Holland was far more complex than the caricature suggested. She was intelligent, quick-witted, and eager to engage with the most serious conversations of her age. She read widely, formed opinions, and expressed them openly, even when those around her disapproved of a woman taking such liberties. She had a keen sense of politics and was deeply invested in the fortunes of the Whig Party. Far from being concerned only with her own pleasures, she sought to create a space where ideas could be exchanged, where debate could flourish, and where she herself could participate as an equal. This reality, however, was often obscured by the noise of scandal. Her role at Holland House became the stage on which the two sides of her identity played out. Publicly, she was the scandalous Lady Holland, the subject of gossip and disapproval. Privately, within the walls of her home, she was a hostess of remarkable skill, able to bring together some of the most influential figures of her time. Men who had read about her impropriety in the papers often found themselves sitting at her table, drawn into spirited conversation, leaving with an impression of a woman who was far more than the gossip suggested. This duality shows how the construction of a public persona can obscure reality, but also how determined individuals can transcend it by the sheer force of their intellect and ambition. The common image of Lady Holland in her own time was of a woman who craved attention, who thrived on notoriety, and who wielded her sharp tongue without restraint. Stories circulated of her arrogance, her cutting remarks, and her sometimes imperious treatment of others. These tales were repeated so often that they became accepted truths. Yet even those who criticized her admitted, often grudgingly, that she possessed remarkable intelligence. Her wit, though biting, was undeniable. Her confidence, though unsettling to some, gave her a presence that could not be ignored. This gap between perception and reality raises an important point. When society defines someone through scandal, it is easier to dismiss the rest of their qualities. In Lady Holland's case, the scandal of her divorce and remarriage provided a convenient explanation for her boldness. She was simply shameless. But this explanation overlooks her deliberate choice to step outside the narrow expectations for women, her ambition to be part of political and intellectual life, and her success in doing so. She was not merely scandalous, she was purposeful. She knew the cost of her choices and bore them because the alternative, silence and conformity, did not suit her. If we look at the testimonies of those who spent time at Holland House, a richer picture emerges. Visitors describe evenings filled with debate, where Lady Holland was not content to remain in the background but joined the conversation with vigor. She challenged arguments, pressed for clarity, and sometimes dismissed views she found weak. Her presence was not ornamental, but central. She did not create Holland House simply as a backdrop for her husband's political circle. She shaped it actively, using her position to draw people together and to guide the flow of discussion. In doing so, she built a form of influence that was rare for a woman of her time. Of course, the contradictions in her life remained. She supported the abolition of slavery and aligned herself with reformist causes, yet her family wealth derived from estates worked by enslaved people in Jamaica. This inconsistency did not escape criticism. Still, the willingness to take public stances on difficult issues marks her as someone who engaged seriously with the questions of her day. To reduce her to gossip alone is to miss the substance of a woman who, in both her flaws and her achievements, represented a more complex reality than society was willing to acknowledge. The persistence of her reputation as scandalous shows how powerful first impressions can be, especially when tied to gender expectations. A man who divorced, remarried, and held strong political views would have been judged differently, often with less severity. For Lady Holland, those same actions marked her as notorious. Yet she refused to let that reputation silence her. She continued to speak, to host, to write, and to assert herself. In doing so, she transcended the limitations placed upon her by the judgments of others. Her journals reveal a woman keenly aware of how she was seen, but unwilling to change her nature for approval. She wrote candidly of her impressions, her friendships, her frustrations, and her views on politics. These private writings stand in contrast to the public persona shaped by gossip. They show not a caricature but a real human being, thoughtful and sharp, both critical and vulnerable. They remind us that beneath every public image lies a private reality that is richer and more complicated than the surface suggests. Lady Holland's story therefore asks us to reconsider the way we judge historical figures. If we accept the scandalous reputation as the whole truth, we miss the ways in which she influenced her world. We miss the salon that became a hub of political life, the encouragement she gave to writers and thinkers, and the example she set, however controversial, of a woman refusing to be confined by social norms. By looking deeper, we see a life that was not simply defined by scandal, but one that used notoriety as a platform for influence. This interplay between the public and the private continues to resonate today. Just as modern celebrities are often trapped by the image constructed around them, Lady Holland was caught in the tension between who she really was and how society chose to see her. Yet while many remain confined by their public image, she managed, in her own way, to transcend it. Her intellect, her ambition, and her influence outlived the gossip. She remains a figure remembered not only for scandal, but also for the mark she left on politics and culture. Lady Holland's life shows that scandal may capture attention, but substance sustains legacy. The public persona, shaped by gossip, was only one layer. Beneath it was a woman of intelligence and drive who refused to be silenced. To focus only on the headlines of her time is to miss the deeper truth of a life lived with energy, conviction, and a refusal to conform. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson she leaves. That reputation, however loud, cannot erase the reality of influence earned through intellect and ambition. The tension between Lady Holland's public persona and her private reality naturally leads us to consider where her real influence came from. If the surface of her reputation was scandal and notoriety, the foundation of her actual power rested on something far more lasting. That foundation was Holland House. The home she shared with Lord Holland became a center of gravity for politics, literature, and science in early 19th century Britain. The gatherings she hosted were not idle entertainments. They were deliberate spaces where ideas were exchanged, alliances were formed, and the future direction of the nation was quietly debated. Lady Holland was not merely present at these salons. She orchestrated them. Her reputation might have been questioned, but her ability to shape conversation and build networks made her one of the most influential hostesses of her age. To understand this influence, we must first grasp what a salon meant at the time. In Paris, salons had long been recognized as crucial spaces where aristocrats, writers, and thinkers met under the guidance of a clever hostess. England had fewer such traditions, but Holland House filled that role. The house itself, a grand mansion in Kensington dating back to the Elizabethan era, provided the stage. Yet the real force behind its significance was not the bricks and gardens, but the woman who directed the gatherings inside. Lady Holland made Holland House into more than a residence. She turned it into a political and cultural engine. The composition of her salons reflected her purpose. Politicians, poets, scientists, philosophers, and foreign dignitaries found themselves seated at her table or conversing in her drawing rooms. The mix was intentional. She believed in bringing together minds that might not otherwise meet, creating conversations that mattered. Whig politicians relied on Holland House as a kind of informal headquarters when out of office. Writers found there an audience for their ideas. Visitors from abroad found themselves introduced to the leading lights of British society. The effect was cumulative. By the early years of the 19th century, Holland House had become synonymous with liberal thought and reformist energy. Key figures of the age moved through these rooms. Charles James Fox, one of the greatest Whig statesmen, was a frequent presence until his death. Lord Byron, the poet whose fame and scandal rivaled any in his time, was welcomed and admired. Sidney Smith, the wit and clergyman, contributed to the sparkling conversations. Foreigners such as the American statesman John Quincy Adams recorded their impressions of Holland House, noting the intellectual vitality they encountered. The roster of guests could have filled volumes. Each brought ideas, and each carried away impressions shaped by Lady Holland's hand. Her role was not passive. Accounts describe her directing conversation, challenging assumptions, and ensuring that debates remained lively. Unlike the silent hostesses of many drawing rooms, she was at the center of her gatherings. She pushed discussions toward politics, science, or literature, depending on her interests or the moment's urgency. She did not shy away from expressing her views, even if they were unpopular. This could be intimidating, and some found her overbearing. But the result was undeniable. Conversations at Holland House mattered. They influenced decisions, shaped opinions, and created connections that extended far beyond Kensington. One striking example of her influence lies in the way Holland House provided a refuge for Whig politicians during long years out of power. In the early decades of the 19th century, the Tory party often held the reins of government. For the Whigs, Holland House was a place where morale was sustained, where policies were debated, and where unity was fostered. It was here that strategies were refined, that younger politicians were introduced to veterans, and that the party's liberal vision was kept alive. Lady Holland was not content merely to listen. She pressed her guests, offered her own views, and reinforced the Whig identity of her circle. Another dimension of her salons was cultural. Literature thrived under her encouragement. Byron, for instance, found both admiration and criticism within her circle. Lady Holland's frank opinions could sting, but writers valued the exposure her salon offered. Her support extended to historians, dramatists, and essayists, who found in Holland House a place where ideas could be tested before an audience that mattered. To be invited was itself a mark of distinction. For rising figures, the opportunity to impress Lady Holland and her guests could open doors to broader recognition. Science, too, found a place at Holland House. Though she herself was not a scientist, Lady Holland respected inquiry and encouraged discussion of discoveries. Figures associated with the Royal Society, travelers returning with reports from distant lands, and physicians with new theories all found themselves welcomed. The presence of such voices in her salons broadened the scope of conversation. It was not only politics or poetry that filled the evenings, but also questions about the natural world, the progress of medicine, and the impact of exploration. By including these perspectives, she ensured that Holland House mirrored the intellectual energy of the time. What made her influence particularly strategic was her ability to link these spheres together. A politician might leave Holland House with a new appreciation for a literary movement. A poet might find inspiration in political debate. A scientist might be drawn into discussion of reform. Lady Holland acted as the thread that connected these domains. In doing so, she created a network that was greater than the sum of its parts. The conversations she nurtured did not vanish with the evening's close. They continued in Parliament, in print, and in private correspondence, carrying with them the spirit of Holland House. Critics sometimes dismissed her influence as social rather than substantive, but this is to underestimate the power of networking in the 19th century. Decisions in politics often grew out of conversations. Alliances were cemented through friendship, and new ideas gained traction when shared in the right company. By orchestrating these interactions, Lady Holland shaped the context in which decisions were made. She may not have voted in Parliament, but she influenced those who did. She may not have published treatises, but she provided the environment in which treatises were discussed, refined, and supported. Specific examples highlight this role. The debates over Catholic emancipation, a central issue of the early 19th century, found resonance within Holland House. Whig leaders used the salon as a space to articulate their arguments and strengthen their resolve. Lady Holland's support was evident, and her insistence on discussing such topics reinforced their urgency. Similarly, discussions about reform of Parliament itself, which would culminate in the Reform Act later in the century, were sustained by the intellectual climate she nurtured. Holland House was not the only site where these ideas were debated, but it was among the most important outside Parliament itself. The international dimension of her salons added another layer. Diplomats and travelers brought perspectives that widened the horizons of her guests. Visitors from Italy, Spain, and the Americas encountered in Holland House a sympathetic audience for liberal causes. Lady Holland herself took keen interest in foreign affairs. She admired Napoleon, a controversial stance in Britain, and defended him even after his fall. This position reflected both her independence of thought and her willingness to defy popular opinion. Within the walls of Holland House, such views could be expressed and debated in ways that might have been impossible elsewhere. Her influence extended beyond the living guests of her salons. Through her journals and correspondence, she preserved the flavor of her gatherings and her own perspective on the people she encountered. These writings reveal how carefully she observed those around her, noting their strengths, their weaknesses, and their ideas. For historians, they provide invaluable insights into the intellectual life of the era. For her contemporaries, they served as reminders that to be noticed by Lady Holland meant to be remembered, for better or worse. It is important to remember that none of this was accidental. Lady Holland consciously built her role as the architect of Holland House's influence. She chose her guests, guided their interactions, and asserted her presence. She was not content to let her reputation as scandalous define her. Instead, she created a sphere in which her talents could flourish and her influence could be exercised. This was her response to the judgment of society, to show that she could matter in ways that gossip could not erase. The salons of Holland House stand as proof of her success. They were not simply fashionable gatherings, but essential hubs of political and intellectual life. Their impact was felt in the shaping of policy, the encouragement of literature, and the spread of scientific curiosity. At the center of it all stood Lady Holland, directing, challenging, and inspiring. Her scandalous reputation may have opened the story of her life, but her salons wrote the chapters that followed. By building this base of influence, she transcended the shallow judgments of her time and secured a legacy that speaks to her ambition and her intellect. The brilliance of Holland House and the power it generated for Lady Holland through her salons often concealed another reality, one that was quieter but just as significant in shaping her character. If she appeared commanding in her drawing rooms, directing conversation and influencing the course of political debates, her private life told a story of constant battles. These were battles not only against society's judgment, but also within her own home, her own body, and her own heart. To understand Lady Holland fully, we must look beyond the glamour of her public role and see the toll exacted by scandal, illness, and loss. Her marriage to Lord Holland was in many ways a partnership of shared political commitment and mutual respect, yet it was also a source of strain. Lord Holland was a gentle and accommodating man, known for his good nature and his loyalty to friends. He lacked, however, the force of personality that defined his wife. Many who knew them observed the imbalance. She dominated where he yielded, she pressed where he avoided conflict. While this dynamic allowed her to take command of Holland House, it also left her with a burden of responsibility that could be heavy. She was the driver, the enforcer, the one who pushed for consistency in Whig gatherings and intellectual exchange. At times, this placed strain on their marriage. To the outside world, she appeared imperious. Within her marriage, she was often the force holding together the household's identity and purpose. The shadow of her past never left her. Though she had secured her place beside Lord Holland, society at large never forgave her for the divorce that made it possible. The aristocracy prided itself on discretion, and her bold disregard for convention remained a mark against her. Many women of her rank cut ties, unwilling to be associated with her perceived shamelessness. Invitations that might otherwise have flowed easily to a woman of her status were withheld. Her presence at public events could draw whispers, and she was reminded again and again that scandal, once attached, was not easily shed. The salons of Holland House were, in part, her answer to this ostracism. If society would not embrace her, she would build her own society, one that mattered more. Yet even as she succeeded, the sting of rejection lingered. Lady Holland's resilience was tested not only socially, but personally through repeated losses. She bore children, but not all survived, and those who did became central to her sense of purpose. Motherhood brought her both joy and anguish. The loss of children in infancy or youth was tragically common in the 19th century, yet for her, each loss deepened the private pain beneath her commanding exterior. Grief was not something she displayed openly in the way she displayed her political opinions, but it shaped her nonetheless. It taught her endurance. It may also explain, in part, her sharpness. A woman who carried grief often cloaked it in firmness, unwilling to show vulnerability in a world already quick to condemn her. Her own health became another constant battle. She suffered from recurring illness, particularly digestive disorders, which left her in pain and weakened for long periods. Medical knowledge at the time offered little relief. Treatments were often harsh, diets restrictive, and doctors inconsistent in their advice. For a woman so invested in the life of the mind and the vibrancy of conversation, these physical limitations were especially cruel. There were stretches when she could not preside over her salons with her usual vigor, when illness forced her into retreat. Yet time and again she returned, determined not to let frailty define her. Her resilience was not simply intellectual. It was physical, the capacity to push through weakness in order to maintain her role. These struggles did not occur in private silence. Living under the glare of public scrutiny meant that her illnesses, her grief, and her marital dynamics were often subject to commentary. Letters from acquaintances sometimes alluded to her health with an edge of judgment, as though her ailments were exaggerated or self-inflicted. Others commented on the tension between her and Lord Holland, interpreting it as proof of her domineering character rather than as the complicated reality of a long partnership. Every aspect of her private life could be used to reinforce the caricature of her public persona. To endure this constant scrutiny required not only strength, but also a willingness to accept that she would never be free of gossip. The emotional toll was immense. Imagine a woman who, in her own home, fostered some of the greatest minds of her age, yet who could not walk into a gathering outside those walls without whispers following her. Imagine a woman who believed in reform, in progress, and in justice, yet who was judged endlessly for the personal choices that made her independence possible. The burden of being always observed, always measured against expectations, left scars that shaped her interactions. At times she was defensive, quick to cut with her wit before others could cut her with their disapproval. At other times she leaned into the role of the intimidating hostess, preferring to be feared than to be pitied. Her journals reveal glimpses of this inner landscape. They show a woman who could be deeply critical of others, but also deeply self-aware. She recognized her flaws and her failings. She admitted the strain of her illnesses, the disappointments of her social life, the challenges of marriage. She did not always soften her judgments, either of herself or of others. Yet through these writings, we see resilience at work. The decision to keep going, to keep speaking, to keep shaping her world even when that world was often hostile. It is tempting to view her story solely through the lens of strength, as though her resilience was unbroken. But resilience is not the absence of suffering. It is the persistence through suffering. Lady Holland suffered deeply, through ostracism, through loss, through illness, and through the constant reminder that her life was lived under a cloud of disapproval. What makes her remarkable is not that she avoided pain, but that she refused to let pain silence her. She endured, and in enduring, she carved a place for herself that no amount of scandal could erase. Her personal battles also shaped her legacy in subtle ways. They gave her empathy for causes of reform, an understanding of how harsh and unyielding society could be. They gave her urgency, a sense that life was not to be wasted in silence or submission. They gave her authority, for people recognized that she had paid a price for her independence and continued to stand tall despite it. When guests at Holland House saw her, they saw not only the commanding hostess but also, whether they admitted it or not, a woman who had survived more than most could endure. Lady Holland's life beyond the salons was thus a mixture of brilliance and burden. She navigated a world that demanded her silence, yet could not ignore her voice. She bore losses that would have crushed others, yet found ways to keep contributing. She managed illnesses that weakened her body, yet never let them weaken her determination. And she lived every day with the knowledge that society had judged her once and would never forgive her, yet she built a sphere of influence that made forgiveness unnecessary. In tracing these struggles, we see the human side of a figure often remembered only for her scandal or her sharpness. She was not invulnerable. She was not immune to pain. She was, in many ways, more exposed to it than most, precisely because her life played out in public view. To acknowledge her personal battles is not to diminish her achievements, but to deepen our understanding of them. They show us that her influence was not the product of an easy life, but of a hard one, mastered through resilience. This resilience is what ultimately defined her. Beyond the scandal, beyond the gossip, beyond the caricatures, Lady Holland was a woman who faced adversity on every front, social, personal, physical, and who refused to surrender. Her salons may have been her most visible legacy, but her personal battles were the crucible in which her strength was forged. Without them, the commanding hostess of Holland House might never have emerged. With them, she became not only a figure of scandal but also a figure of endurance, whose life reminds us that true influence is often built not on ease but on the determination to persist against all odds. Lady Holland's resilience in the face of scandal, loss, and illness offers us a clear sense of her strength, but it would be incomplete to stop there. If her salons at Holland House gave her a platform and her personal battles forged her determination, the true measure of her life lies in her lasting contributions. These contributions were not always loudly acknowledged in her own time, and even now they remain overshadowed by the gossip that first defined her name. Yet when we look closely, we see a woman who played a crucial part in shaping intellectual life, who supported art and letters, who influenced politics through persistence and presence, and who pushed boundaries in ways that reverberate far beyond her own century. The intellectual discourse of early 19th century Britain did not unfold only in universities, lecture halls, or parliament. Much of it took place in private homes, where discussion was freer, conversation more candid, and new ideas could be tested. Holland House was one of the most significant of these spaces. Lady Holland created a setting where different disciplines met, where the boundaries between politics, literature, and science blurred. She not only welcomed writers, philosophers, and politicians, but also insisted that their ideas be interrogated and debated. She directed conversation, asked sharp questions, and offered her own insights. The presence of a hostess who actively shaped discussion gave Holland House a distinctive quality. It was not simply a venue, it was an arena of thought. In fostering this intellectual exchange, Lady Holland contributed to the development of liberal ideas at a critical moment. The early 19th century was a time of ferment. Questions of reform, religious freedom, the role of the monarchy, and the structure of parliament were pressing. At Holland House, these questions were not only discussed but tested in dialogue, argued over by those who would go on to shape policy. Lady Holland's influence in this setting was not incidental. She set the tone, she demanded rigor, and she challenged her guests. While her name never appeared in the official records of debate, her presence was felt in the sharpening of arguments, the strengthening of networks, and the sustaining of morale among those who believed in reform. Her patronage of the arts was equally significant. Writers found in her both a critic and a supporter. Byron valued the platform she provided, though her frankness could sting. Sidney Smith appreciated her encouragement, as did historians and essayists who sought recognition. By giving space to artists and intellectuals, she ensured that their voices reached influential ears. Holland House became a kind of testing ground where new works were read, new ideas tried, and reputations made or challenged. For many, the approval or disapproval of Lady Holland could tip the balance. This role as arbiter of taste may not have been formal, but it mattered deeply in a culture where patronage and social approval could determine success. Her contributions extended beyond hosting. She actively supported the distribution of books, encouraged translations, and took interest in the education of her children and others in her circle. She believed in the importance of knowledge, not as a private pursuit, but as a social force. Her journals reflect a mind engaged with the great works of literature, history, and philosophy. She was not content to be a passive consumer of culture. She sought to shape it. By directing attention to certain authors, by insisting that important works be read and discussed, she acted as a cultural gatekeeper whose influence stretched beyond her immediate circle. In politics, her role was more subtle, but no less important. The Whig Party's survival during long years out of power owed much to the community sustained at Holland House. Politicians who might have grown disheartened found encouragement there. Younger members of the party found mentorship and connection. Foreign sympathizers found solidarity. Lady Holland's part in this was not ceremonial. She was deeply partisan, passionately committed to liberal principles, and unafraid to voice her opinions. She reminded her guests of the importance of persistence, reinforced their convictions, and made her home a sanctuary where reformist ideals could thrive. This was influence exercised not through speeches or pamphlets, but through presence, persuasion, and persistence. Her foresight is evident in the causes she embraced. She supported the abolition of slavery at a time when vested interests in Britain resisted it fiercely. Though her family wealth was tied to colonial estates, she recognized the moral wrong of slavery and lent her voice to reform. She advocated for religious toleration, including Catholic emancipation, while before it was politically convenient. She was sympathetic to movements for parliamentary reform, sensing the need for broader representation. In all these cases, she aligned herself with progress before it became safe to do so. Her positions, once radical, were later recognized as necessary. What is striking about her legacy is how unconventional it was. She did not fit the mold of the virtuous wife or the silent hostess. She claimed authority in conversation, challenged men in debate, and demanded to be heard. Her style was sharp, sometimes abrasive, but it forced those around her to take her seriously. Many dismissed her as arrogant, yet their very irritation was proof that she had made herself impossible to ignore. In doing so, she expanded the space available for women in intellectual and political life. She did not claim equality in formal terms, but she lived it in practice, exercising authority in the ways open to her. Reconsidering her legacy also means acknowledging how her actions pushed against societal boundaries. She defied the expectation of silence for women, the demand for submission in marriage, and the narrow limits of female influence. She bore the cost of scandal but refused to retreat into obscurity. She insisted on building a platform for herself, not through rebellion in the streets, but through careful orchestration of her home. In this way, she reshaped the boundaries of what a woman could do within the framework of her class and era. The question arises, what do we make of Lady Holland today? Her story resonates with ongoing debates about women in power and the scrutiny they face. Women in politics, business, and culture still encounter disproportionate criticism of their personal lives, their style, and their demeanor. A man who is assertive is praised as confident. A woman who is assertive is criticized as arrogant. A man's past may be overlooked. A woman's past becomes her permanent reputation. Lady Holland's life shows us that these double standards are not new. They have deep roots, and they continue to shape perceptions of women who claim authority. Her legacy invites us to reflect on how we tell stories of women in history. Do we focus on the scandal, the gossip, the sharp edges of personality? Or do we also recognize the substance of their contributions, the courage of their choices, and the influence they exerted despite obstacles? In Lady Holland's case, the temptation to remember only the scandal is strong, for it was colorful and shocking. Yet to stop there is to miss the deeper truth. She was a builder of networks, a patron of culture, a force in politics, and a woman whose foresight aligned with progress. To reconsider her legacy is not to excuse her flaws or deny her contradictions. She could be harsh, imperious, and inconsistent. She lived from the profits of slavery, even as she denounced it. She hurt some of those closest to her with her cutting tongue. But legacies are always complex, and in hers the contradictions coexist with the achievements. What matters is that she mattered. She shaped her world, and her world remembered her. The lasting lesson of Lady Holland is that influence often comes in forms that official history overlooks. It is not only speeches in parliament or works in print that change society, but also the conversations fostered in private rooms, the encouragement given to writers, the persistence of ideals kept alive through years of opposition. By building Holland House into a center of thought, by sustaining her circle through scandal and hardship, by insisting on her own right to speak, Lady Holland left behind a legacy that deserves recognition. And so we ask, how does her story resonate with us today? It reminds us that women who step beyond prescribed roles will always face scrutiny, that their reputations will be shaped by gossip as much as by achievement, and that their contributions may be overlooked if we do not look deeper. It also reminds us that influence is not limited to official power. It can be built in salons, in conversations, in networks, and in persistence. Lady Holland's life, in all its scandal and brilliance, shows us that even when judged harshly, a woman can transcend the verdicts of her time and leave a mark that endures. Lady Holland's story lingers in the mind not simply because of her salons, her scandals, or even her undeniable intellect, but because it forces us to confront questions that remain unresolved in our own age. She lived in a world that limited women severely, a world that defined their value through marriage, propriety, and silence. Yet she refused to accept those boundaries. She chose instead to create a life that, while unconventional and costly in reputation, allowed her agency, voice, and influence. To call her a woman ahead of her time is to acknowledge both her defiance of expectation and her foresight in understanding how culture and politics could be shaped from behind the scenes. But it also invites us to reflect on what it means to be ahead of one's time, and how such figures are treated by their contemporaries and remembered by later generations. Her life connects directly with the modern tension between a woman's achievements and the narratives that frame her in public. In the early 19th century, Lady Holland was judged primarily through the lens of her divorce and remarriage, her domineering reputation, and her sharp tongue. These became the headlines, the shorthand by which she was known. Rarely did the public narrative dwell on the intellectual rigor of her salons, the importance of her networks, or the political courage she demonstrated in supporting reformist causes. Instead, scandal defined her image. This pattern is not unfamiliar today. Women in positions of power are still often reduced to caricatures. Their clothing scrutinized, their tone dissected, their personal choices magnified beyond proportion, while their contributions risk being overlooked. The same forces of gossip and superficial judgment that shaped Lady Holland's reputation echo in the treatment of female leaders in our own time. This continuity raises the question of how much progress has truly been made. Lady Holland's defiance of convention cost her dearly in terms of acceptance, but it also secured her independence and authority. Modern women in politics and culture often face the same choice: conform to expectations and be judged safe but insignificant, or challenge them and face a backlash of scrutiny. The dilemma Lady Holland navigated remains with us, though the terms have changed. She was condemned for divorce, for frankness, for dominance in her marriage. Today, women may be condemned for ambition, for assertiveness, or for failing to adhere to narrow ideals of femininity. The underlying issue is the same. When women step beyond prescribed roles, society is quick to police them. Lady Holland also demonstrates the resilience required to persist under such scrutiny. Her illnesses, her grief, and her ostracism might have silenced her, yet she chose otherwise. Resilience for her was not an abstract ideal, but a daily practice of continuing to host, to speak, to read, to debate, even when society withheld its approval. In this way, her life speaks powerfully to modern discussions of resilience in women. Too often, women who endure hostile environments are celebrated only for their toughness, as though resilience were an end in itself. Lady Holland's story shows us that resilience matters because it makes possible the continuation of contribution. She endured not to prove her strength, but to preserve her ability to shape culture and politics. Reevaluating her legacy also compels us to think about the importance of looking beyond headlines, both past and present. If we confine Lady Holland to the label of scandalous hostess, we miss the larger significance of her life. If we confine modern women in power to caricatures created by media narratives, we fail to appreciate the depth of their contributions. History teaches us that reputations are fragile and often misleading. To see Lady Holland clearly, we must sift through the gossip and uncover the substance. The same discipline is required today if we are to understand women in power fairly. Calling Lady Holland ahead of her time also means recognizing how she challenged the prevailing narratives of her own age. She insisted on claiming authority in conversation, on directing debates, on shaping intellectual life. These were not roles women were expected to play. She expanded the possibilities for women not by campaigning openly for rights, but by embodying independence in her daily life. She demonstrated that women could hold authority, could be formidable in intellect, could influence politics, and could do so without apology. While she did not live to see broader emancipation, she prepared the ground for it by showing that women could defy convention and still command respect. Her story resonates with our era of reassessment, when historians and the public alike revisit figures once dismissed or caricatured. We are more attuned now to the ways in which women's contributions were minimized or erased. Lady Holland's life fits into this broader project of recovery. To reconsider her not only as a scandalous figure, but as a force of influence is to do justice to her complexity. It is also to remind ourselves that history is always written through the lens of power, and that women like Lady Holland were too often written out or reduced to footnotes. But does being ahead of one's time necessarily mean being misunderstood by it? Lady Holland's case suggests so. Her contemporaries could not reconcile her defiance of propriety with her contributions to culture and politics. To them, her scandal overshadowed her influence. Yet posterity can see more clearly, recognizing that her unconventional path allowed her to achieve what conformity would not have. In this sense, being ahead of her time was both a burden and a gift. A burden because she endured scorn, but a gift because she left behind a model of female agency that later generations could admire. Her legacy also prompts reflection on the role of women as cultural mediators. She was not in Parliament, nor did she publish major works, yet she shaped the intellectual environment in which both political decisions and cultural trends developed. Her power was indirect but real, rooted in conversation, connection, and the authority of presence. This reminds us that influence often takes forms overlooked by formal histories of power. Women have long exercised authority in these less visible ways, and Lady Holland exemplifies how effective such influence could be. Recognizing her contributions requires us to broaden our definition of power, to include not only the visible levers of office, but also the subtler forms of cultural authority. The scrutiny Lady Holland faced also highlights the persistent tension between private life and public reputation. Her divorce, her marriage, her illnesses, her grief, all were public knowledge and subject to commentary. This intrusion into her private life shaped how she was perceived. Modern women in leadership face a similar intrusion, though magnified by media and technology. Their personal choices are treated as public property, and judgments about their character are often drawn from intimate details rather than public achievements. Lady Holland's experience shows that this is not a new phenomenon, but one deeply ingrained in how societies police women's authority. To ask whether she was ahead of her time is also to ask how we measure progress. Have we moved beyond the patterns that constrained her, or do they persist in new forms? The continued double standards in evaluating women suggest that her struggles remain relevant. Yet the fact that we can now reassess her legacy, see beyond the scandal, and recognize her contributions also suggests progress in how we view women in history. Each reevaluation adds to a broader recognition that women have always been central to cultural and political life, even when official records ignored them. Lady Holland's story ultimately resonates because it combines defiance, resilience, and influence in ways that continue to inspire. She was judged harshly, but she persisted. She was excluded, but she created her own circle. She was dismissed as scandalous, but she shaped intellectual and political life. In her contradictions, we see the difficulties of being a woman who sought agency in a restrictive society. In her achievements, we see the possibilities opened by courage and persistence. Her life compels us to ask, how do we judge women who defy convention? Do we reduce them to their scandals, their flaws, their sharpness? Or do we see the broader picture, the ways in which they contributed, influenced, and endured? Lady Holland reminds us that the latter perspective is necessary if we are to understand history honestly. She was not a saint, nor was she a villain. She was a complex human being who lived fully, defied norms, and left her mark. In this sense, Lady Holland's story does not belong only to the past. It speaks to our present, where women continue to fight for agency, continue to be judged more harshly than men, and continue to find their contributions overshadowed by narrative and gossip. Her example challenges us to resist these patterns, to look deeper, and to value substance over scandal. If we do, we honor not only her legacy, but also the broader struggle of women across history to claim their place as full participants in cultural and political life. Thus, Lady Holland was indeed ahead of her time, not because she lived in some imagined future, but because she forced her own time to confront what it resisted. That a woman could be sharp, ambitious, influential, and unapologetically herself. That confrontation remains unfinished, which is why her life continues to matter. She reminds us that women in power will always face scrutiny, but that resilience, intellect, and courage can transform even scandal into legacy. Lady Holland's story cannot close on the note of her resilience and her unconventional influence alone. To leave it there would risk making her life into a sealed narrative, as though we could sum her up neatly and move on. But her story is more than biography. It is an invitation to rethink how we tell history, how we judge those who lived before us, and how we confront the biases that distort our understanding of complex people. When we look at Lady Holland, we see not only a woman judged harshly for her choices, but also the evidence of how history has often repeated that same judgment without question. To do justice to her, and to others like her, we must challenge the narratives that have survived, examine them critically, and ask whose voices have been lost or obscured. History is filled with figures remembered more for scandal than for substance, more for the gossip surrounding them than for the influence they wielded. Lady Holland is a clear example, but she is not alone. Many women of the past who dared to live differently found themselves caricatured in this way. Their contributions were dismissed or minimized, their flaws magnified, and their reputations shaped by those who found their independence threatening. If we read history uncritically, we risk repeating those old judgments, passing them forward into our own time, and failing to appreciate the complexity of human lives. Lady Holland's life challenges us to resist that habit. She asks us, across 2 centuries, to look closer, to look deeper, to reconsider. This rethinking matters because history shapes not only our understanding of the past, but also our imagination of the present. If we believe that women of earlier centuries were silent, compliant, and without influence, we reinforce the idea that women's agency is a recent invention, an exception rather than a constant. But when we uncover stories like Lady Holland's, we see that women have always been present, always been influential, always pushed against the limits of their societies. Their contributions may have been hidden, their reputations clouded, but their impact is real. Acknowledging this does not only honor them, it gives us a truer picture of the past and a richer sense of continuity in the struggle for agency and recognition. Challenging prevailing narratives requires effort. It asks us to question the sources, to consider who wrote them and why, to read between the lines of letters, diaries, and accounts. In Lady Holland's case, much of what we know comes from those who admired or despised her, and both groups had reasons to emphasize certain aspects of her personality. Admiring guests at Holland House praised her intellect, but often mentioned her sharpness, as if it were a flaw. Critics harped on her scandal and arrogance. Rarely did they stop to recognize the courage it took to keep going in the face of relentless judgment. It is only by piecing together these fragments, by listening not only to what is said, but also to what is unsaid, that we begin to recover a fuller picture of her. There is also a broader lesson here about how we consume stories, both historical and modern. Scandal is captivating. It grabs attention. It sticks in the memory. That is why Lady Holland's divorce overshadowed her intellectual contributions, why her reputation as imperious outlived her role as cultural architect. The same remains true today. Scandal dominates headlines, while substance is buried. To resist this temptation in history is also to resist it in the present. To demand more than the easy story, to insist on depth rather than sensationalism. Lady Holland's story becomes not just history, but also a cautionary tale about how narratives are made and why we must interrogate them. For modern audiences, there is power in revisiting figures like Lady Holland with fresh eyes. Doing so allows us to see the continuities across centuries in how women are judged, how agency is punished, and how influence is obscured. It also allows us to recover forgotten histories that enrich our understanding of the past. Lady Holland may not be a household name today, but her life shaped the intellectual and political climate of her age in ways still felt in the trajectories of reform, literature, and culture. Recognizing her helps us see that history is not only made by the figures whose names fill official records, but also by those whose salons, conversations, and defiance quietly shifted the currents of society. The call here is simple but profound. Rethink history. Look beyond the surface. Question the narratives that have been handed down. Ask what has been overlooked, who has been misrepresented, and why. When we do this, we not only honor figures like Lady Holland, but also gain tools to think critically about our own time. The treatment she endured in the early 19th century has its echoes in the 21st, and recognizing that continuity helps us see the patterns that need to be broken. Her story, in the end, is not only about her. It is about us. It is about how we read, how we remember, how we judge. It is about whether we are content to accept gossip as truth, or whether we will demand deeper, fairer, more complex accounts. Lady Holland was flawed, complicated, and controversial. She was also brilliant, resilient, and influential. To hold both truths together is to see her fully. To reduce her to one or the other is to miss the point. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson she leaves us. That people, especially women who step into spaces of power, cannot be captured by simple narratives. So I leave you with a question. How many other Lady Hollands lie hidden in history, dismissed as scandalous or difficult, when in fact they were shaping the world in ways we have not yet recognized? How many lives have been flattened by gossip into caricature, when in truth they were full of contradictions, achievements, and struggles worth remembering? To explore these stories is not only to do justice to the past, but to enrich our present understanding of agency, resilience, and power. If this story has made you rethink the way we talk about history, I encourage you to carry that forward. Share your thoughts about how often history misrepresents complex figures, how scandal and narrative overshadow substance, and how we might begin to recover what has been lost. And if you want to keep diving into stories like this, stories of overlooked lives, forgotten influences, and narratives that deserve another look, then join me again for the next exploration. There are countless figures like Lady Holland waiting to be rediscovered, and together we can bring them back into the light.